It's Nick Wooten. Welcome to Consumer Trial Lawyer Academy. I wanted to talk to you today about the process of doing an intake. Everyone's done intakes before, and there are different types of intakes for different scenarios. But basically, what we're wanting to do is talk with you about, how do I do this when I've got a case or a client where I think there's the potential for let's call it a big case, whatever that amounts to in your mind. Obviously, there's degrees of intake. We always have multiple degrees of intake. 25 years I was solo. There were multiple degrees of intake in that setting. Ever since I joined the firm, for about the last 18 months, we have multiple levels of intake. So let's talk about that structure. First, it's important that the very first contact with your client, that you have someone who's handling that contact who has been well trained enough and competent enough to do a couple of things. First, you obviously want to instill some confidence in the client that your firm has the competence to handle their matter and the ability to do so within the rules of the ethics and what you're allowed to say and not say. But the most important thing is to have someone who's competent to get the basic details of whatever the scenario is, and to understand, the type of cases that you're handling well enough to know the right questions to ask. That can be a little harder than you think, obviously. If you've been at this very long, the old saying, good help is hard to find. So it's something that you spend a lot of time on. If you're trying to train others to be an intake team, or you have a professional intake team, you really have to spend time with them to get them focused on the right things. And always, having a sort of series of key questions for types of cases is useful. But, after that initial level of screening is done, then someone's got to figure out what's going on with the case. And that is where, your next level of screening usually comes in. For me, I've been fortunate for more than 15 years now, right at 15 years. I had a wonderful paralegal who worked with me on consumer cases, who I'm fortunate to still be able to work with, who really understands not only what we do with a case, but what we're going to have to prove in the case to be successful. So she's always been an outstanding second level of intake, and can really burn through the substance of the facts and get that down in a way that's meaningful. And, usually anything she tells me as far as facts, pretty much always been spot on, never had an issue. That's a true blessing. If you've got someone like that, man, it's a boon to what we do in consumer law, because this ain't, Mrs. Smith ran into the back of Mr. Jones at a red light when it was raining. And, our consumer work is always a higher level of complexity than a car crash case. And that's not to make fun of car wreck cases. They're just very straightforward for the most part, especially when we're just talking about simple collisions as opposed to something like products liability claims. So, having that great second level really helps you get honed in on what are the key things that we need to talk about with the client once the lawyers get involved. What I always have taught my co-counsel, my referring counsel, my colleagues, my friends about that process is really you have to know what testimony is going to sound like in front of a jury. That's something that, it comes with the experience of trying cases and having witnesses in front of a judge or a jury. having a sense of how your client's story will be heard and received, you know, when it comes down to where the rubber meets the road in the courtroom, which is what we're working towards, right? So, one thing about being young and hard-headed and full of energy, I got to do that a lot, and so I heard a lot of it. Some of it was very good, some of it was very poor, a lot of it was in between. But you do gain a keen ear for what tends to turn the knobs with a jury and what tends to increase the volume and the attentiveness when people are testifying. You get a sense of whether you know, what a witness is saying is going to make sense or just be really, really, really bad. And there's ways to handle that, whatever it is. But let's go back to the context of a consumer case. You know, when I'm talking to clients who have lost their home and fear of losing their home, about to lose their home, in litigation over their home, which is a very common scenario for me. You know, obviously I'm looking for how sympathetic the story is. How easy is it for the normal person to hear what's being said and relate to it. And to the extent that this goes, you know, outside the norm of how the default may have occurred or how the situation may have come up, I really want to delve into those details and understand, you know, what is my client going to say to explain how we're in the situation we're in the first place. You know, once we understand that, then, you know, obviously what we're looking for next is how has this impacted the client? You know, what is their scenario? And so for me, you know, that's always something that I like to take place either in a Zoom call or Teams call because of the pandemic. You know, we got very used to that, or in a face-to-face meeting, what I like to call the initial interview. And so, you know, what I want to get into there is how has my client's life been impacted? What's different because of what they're experienced and what's been done to them or is being done to them? And then how am I going to prove that, right? So I'm looking for, at that very moment, what does my client blame on how they've been treated or what's happened to them? What do they point at as how they're hurt? And then once I get a sense of what they're looking at, what they think is the issue, then I tend to go further and try to delve into, you know, what I see myself all the time. And so, few things that we see when consumers have been exposed to long-term, you know, stress and difficulties. For men, we typically see high blood pressure and cardiac issues are relatively common events. For women, we often see autoimmune diseases crop up and activate and become, if they were pre-existed, they become more severe. Or if they never existed before, they come onto the scene and cause problems. For some reason, those things tend to happen a lot in consumer litigation. Maybe it's because it goes on for years usually, but it definitely seems like something that's tied to the longevity of the event. Now, to the extent that I have clients who are married, a married couple, you know, what I'm looking for are the changes in their relationship. What's different? Do they argue more? Do they sleep apart? You know, has their intimate life been interrupted, destroyed? Are they on the verge of divorce? Do they fight all the time? Did they fight all the time before? All those things that are deeply personal that we have to understand to really know how this has impacted our clients and what their situation is. And then oftentimes we also want to know, how does one spouse see what's happened to the other spouse? How do they explain each other's injuries? And how does that sound? And what's the credibility? How can we corroborate these things? And so in that initial intake interview, after the client or clients have been screened by our first wave of intake and our second wave of intake, and they've made it to my desk or my conference room, the next thing I want to know after their evaluation of their own harms, I'm looking for, okay, who else can corroborate these harms? And if you ever heard me speak at any conference, you hear me talk all the times about what I call friends and family witnesses. And so, you're looking for, with your guys, their siblings, their beer drinking buddy, their office coworker that they confide in, their best friend from church, their anyone who falls in that role of confidant or trusted friend that they talk to about these situations. Definitely want those people. But what about the people who just know them well, who they may not have ever said, here's my story, here's what we're going through? Those are typically your best witnesses in the entire case, because they have a set of observations that are usually very meaningful and impactful, and oftentimes they don't even know why their friend or family member is different or changed. They just know that they have seen them suffering, maybe in silence, maybe without ever saying what was going on. And so, hugely important to identify those people very early on at that initial meeting if possible, and then get information on, setting up an actual meeting with those folks to either confirm or, have a conversation about what their observations are of your potential clients, how they see what they've been through. Because those people in a trial are unimpeachable and powerful. And they're also witnesses who are very short. And so, I'm looking for those folks because I want to stack them all around my clients during a trial to make sure that everything's not on my client's back to be a perfect witness. If my client has warts, friends and family witnesses can, burnish them up through being able to tell the story from another person's perspective who's disinterested financially from the case. They're only there because, they have the relationship with your client. And that testimony in the courtroom is essentially security against anyone ever being able to attack your verdict after the trial for lacking sufficient evidence to support it. Because almost any jurisdiction you go to is going to say the plaintiff's testimony is enough, but, right? So a judge can say they don't believe just your client. That's a terrible place to be in a post-trial motion. But if you have friends and family witnesses, especially if you have a couple, you don't have to have a dozen, 2 or 3, 4, probably enough in most instances. Those people will get you home, and they'll provide a bulwark against are a fortress against any type of attack on the sufficiency of the evidence of your verdict for your verdict after the fact, because that independent corroboration is a belt and suspenders method of making sure that you have powerful testimony that will support the damages that are eventually awarded and prevent someone from successfully claiming that your client contrived their story and there's no other evidence to support the fact that they're injured. So that in and of itself amounts to the primary things that I'm trying to gather from my clients in the initial interview. We'll have a separate video on, document gathering as part of our preliminary matters prior to filing suit. So hope you enjoyed that. Hope it's insightful. And if you did, then whatever YouTube says to do, what is it, like and subscribe? That's awesome. Look forward to having you back for other videos. Thanks.